What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my competitive tier list for the December 2020 format. We finally have the brand new ban list, and what's even better is that we actually had the first event of the new format, so we actually have some preliminary data to be going off of here. Yes, we only have a few weeks left in the year, but I thought this would be good so that when we get into January, we can see how the meta just progresses over the course of a few short weeks. People need to re-engineer combos, people are going to figure out decks more in depth, and I'm really excited to see where things go. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. We're over here on Tier Maker. As always, we've got Tier 0, 1, 2, Rogue, and everything else. This scale is in order of both representation as well as a deck's power. So you're going to notice the best decks are at the top and the worst decks are going to be at the bottom. Obviously, I could cover more decks, but I don't want this video to be an hour long. So we're only going to be covering the most relevant ones based off of the previous event as well as the ban list in general. Starting things off, we have Virtual World. Virtual World, I actually think this is probably the best deck of the format as it currently stands. This deck went completely untouched by the December 2020 ban list. True King of all Calamities is still legal. Boy, that's a lot of fun, right? But this deck is so proficient at spitting out calamities. There's new combos with Chao Fang, the Yang Zing Synchro Monster. When was the last time you heard that name, right? But this card is able to just allow you to go into double True King of all Calamities with ease, and people have picked up on this, and now it's even more difficult than ever to deal with this deck. Even going second, Virtual World is insane. It's able to play through a very decent amount. The deck does have its weaknesses, of course, every deck does, but I think for the time being, just because Calamities is such a threat to deal with, and even if your opponent outs one, you could easily establish another one on the following turn after you break apart your opponent's board. So for those reasons, we have to put Virtual World at the top, and I think it's going to stay that way for quite some time until people figure out how to break the formula here. Next up is Infernoble Knight. This deck took a very significant hit on the most recent list. We had Link Cross get banned, we had Smoke Grenade get banned, and those two cards were very powerful and allowed the deck to do a lot of unfair things. As it currently stands, though, I'm actually going to put Infernoble in the Rogue category. Now, this might surprise some of you. The thing is, when you look at the results of the previous LCS9, which is the first event under the brand new ban list, Infernoble was almost nowhere to be found. This deck has almost just been rendered completely unplayable for the time being. But the reason I'm putting this deck at the Rogue tier is because I haven't lost hope for this deck yet. Yes, you did lose Smoke Grenade, which was one of the most unfair cards, and let's be honest, Smoke Grenade should have been banned like 5 years ago because we knew something like this was going to happen eventually. You did lose Link Cross, which did allow you to extend and either bait out an opponent's negation and kind of play through it, or give you like an extra insurance policy to like ensure that if your combo goes off, you're going to win the game. I think the combos just need to be re-engineered. The deck is still explosive. The deck can still put up some pretty reasonable boards, but I think in these early initial stages of the brand new December 2020 format, people just don't know what new Infernoble Knight is going to look like. The deck's still solid. You have Neo Space Connector and Aqua Dolphin to rip out hand traps if you need to. You're able to do some of your own completely crazy combos, just like a deck like Virtual World can. So while yes, currently the representation for this deck is very, very small, I think people are going to figure it out, and so we'll see what happens in the next few weeks if people are able to come up with something new. So I'm going to put it at Rogue hesitantly. Honestly, it could go to everything else, but I think the deck still has way too much potential to really go that low. Next up is going to be Altergeist. Altergeist actually had a top cut finish, as a matter of fact. I believe it was Altergeist Dogmatica, so that's a pretty cool hybrid. I'm going to put this at the Rogue tier. This has been a deck that's kind of been just a Rogue player's dream for the past several years. Altergeist is fine. It actually has a lot of very neat interactions with the way the format looks. The fact that it has a lot of traps that can do things that, you know, play around some like sort of monster effect negations. You know, VFDs in the format, so having traps that can kind of do something, and then you have that backed by things such as Multi-Faker and just a very solid engine. Altergeist, we all know, is pretty good, but again, I can't really put it above Rogue. I think you might see a little bit of it, especially now that Altergeist Dogmatica actually got a top cut finish. Maybe people will explore it, maybe not. We'll just have to see what happens. Next up is ABC. Dragon Buster's at 3, and guess what? The deck still sucks, so we're putting it at everything else. This deck just is gonna really not do anything, especially when you look at what these other decks are able to do. Dragon Buster could have gone to 3 a long time ago, so I think this is gonna be fine. It's cool for you ABC PC lovers out there, you can actually play 3 Dragon Buster. You can actually like play your deck now. Isn't that nice? But I don't think it's going to do anything. It's just nice that there's another deck that has everything pretty much back at full power. So that's really cool. Eldlich is up next. I'm actually putting Eldlich at tier 1. Yeah, so when it comes to Eldlich, there's a lot of things to discuss here. So Eldlich at its core, actually some of the more pure variants have been standing out and making it to the top tiers of competitive play. The reason for that is because trap cards interact very well with Virtual World. Yeah, True King of all Calamities is a beast, but the thing is, it only stops monster effects. So when you've got stuff like trap cards and a deck that heavily focuses around them, Eldlich actually really doesn't care too much about Calamities and can play just fine underneath it, and really can actually grind the game out very well to be able to actually pull off some wins. There's also hybrid variants of this deck, such as Zodiac Eldlich. I'll go ahead and just throw this in here. I'll put this at tier 2 because there are still like pure Zodiac decks running around. Zodiac Eldlich, I think, is probably like, you know, tier 1.5, if not tier 1. But the more pure versions of Eldlich have actually been standing out amongst the rest. People have been defaulting back to Dragoon of Red Eyes. I told you guys, as soon as this ban list came and there was no hit to Dragoon or Verte Anaconda or Red Eyes Fusion, people were going to start playing Dragoon again, and this format has already been indicative of it. We're probably just going to see more Dragoon as the format progresses because, let's be honest, the card is absolutely busted, but it really is no surprise to see that it has found a home in Eldlich because a lot of people did play Dragoon in Eldlich in the past. There were a lot of people playing Eldlich this past weekend. I think a lot of people are going to continue to do so. There's a lot of refinement. There's a lot of different ways you can play the deck. You can play Pure, you can play Dragoon, you can play Zodiac, you can play Invoke, you can play Dogmatica. There's so many different versions of Eldlich that can still be explored here, but I think it's cool that the Pure one is actually kind of going back to the top. There have been like weird 60 card amalgamations of Eldlich as well that just play a ton of trap cards. Trap cards are really on the rise at the moment. Maybe we'll do a video about that, but Eldlich is definitely at the top, so do not get blindsided. Speaking of Dogmatica, we're going to go ahead and throw this in at tier 2. Dogmatica is kind of represented here by Invoke Dogmatica. I think this is a deck that actually came out of the ban list pretty well. It's a deck that has a pretty reasonable representation when you look at the last event, and I think this is a deck that when we're moving into a more slower control-based format, I think Invoke Dogmatica is going to have a chance to thrive. The deck can play very well in a 1-to-1 kind of war of attrition, and it doesn't do too many things unfair compared to some of these other decks, but nonetheless, you can expect to see a reasonable amount of this deck. At the very least, you're going to see a ton of Dogmatica cards splashed into a plethora of different decks, so Dogmatica is not going anywhere anytime soon, but I'd say Invoke Dogmatica in and of itself is probably going to be sitting at a healthy tier 2. Next up, oh boy, we have Drytron. I'm going to go ahead and throw this up here in front of Eldlich. Man, talk about a breakout deck from Genesis Impact. This deck is ridiculous. Now, if you haven't seen this deck in action, I highly recommend going and looking up matches from this past weekend's LCS 9 so you can see it for yourself, because this deck is bonkers. The fact that this deck can abuse Cyber Angel Ben 10 like 3 to 5 times in a turn, that is just not okay. Like, if this deck manages to stay at the top tiers of competitive play until March, like, Ben 10's gonna get limited. I'm sorry, there's no way that this is going to be allowed to exist for more than 3 months. This deck is able to pump out threats like Vanity's Ruler, which in a format like this that does a ton of special summoning, it's actually very devastating. But if that weren't enough, Vanity's Ruler denying your opponent from special summoning is one thing, but when you can back that up with cards like Herald of the Orange Light, which can negate monster effects, Herald of the Mirage Light, which can negate spells and traps, you've got stuff like Artifact Lancia, which the deck can natively search on top of like almost all of these other cards. So the fact that you can pretty much pick whatever card is best for whatever matchup to protect your Vanity's Ruler and basically just win on the next turn because you can just pump out enough damage to kill the opponent, the deck is nuts. The deck is able to accrue so much advantage. It has a great grind game. I am super impressed, and I can't wait to see what people do with this deck. Get your Droll and Lockbirds, everyone, because you're probably going to need them. But Drytron definitely coming in at tier 1. Now, Evagishki Mind August, no one's going to play this card. Like, you want to play the Ritual deck? Play Drytron. It is far and away better. This is just, like, laughable. Why did they, like... I guess with Gust Kraken came back, people were, like, freaking out, losing their minds. So, clearly they saw that had no impact. So they're like, yeah, you know, put Mind August back. it's the deck's not going to do anything. Next up, we've got Paleozoic. Now, this is another one just like ABC Dragon Buster. This card could have gone to 3 a long time ago, but totally awesome. Being at 3 is pretty cool. I think this will probably see more play than ABC Dragon Buster because you can play this in some other decks as well. People still play Paleozoic Dino Mishes all the time because the card is really strong, but just for a core Paleo deck, don't really expect to see too much. Next up, though, we have Dragon Link, and very similarly to Infernoble Knight, I'm going to put this at Rogue. Now, the deck lost Dragon Buster Destruction Sword. The deck lost Link Cross. So the deck lost a lot of the cards that made the deck insanely powerful, but it didn't lose LP. It didn't lose its starters. It didn't lose a lot of its core components. So I think for this initial breakout of December 2020, people just need to find new ways to make decks like Dragon Link, like Infernoble, just work, right? People need to re-engineer the combos, figure out how this is going to contest with Virtual World and True King of All Calamities, with Drytron and stuff like Vanity's Ruler, like Eldich playing all the shenanigans it does. You know, Eldich was able to go toe-to-toe with these decks, and it was like kind of sitting at tier 2, but Virtual World definitely changes the equation, and both of these decks getting hit basically means that Virtual World is now at the top tier. So again, similarly to Infernoble Knight, Dragon Link saw very little representation over the course of the weekend, but I don't expect it to stay that way for long, and compared to some of these other decks like in the everything else category, I think you're going to see this deck start to slowly go back up once people figure out what the best course of direction is to take the deck. Next up, we have Phantom Knight. I'm going to go ahead and just throw this in Rogue as well. We got Graph and Seer at 3, which is amazing, but even with Burning Abyss and Phantom Knight being at full power, the deck still struggles to compete with some of these other decks. Like True King of All Calamities and Vanity's Ruler, how does Phantom Knight and Burning Abyss compete with that? You know, it's so difficult to play through, and yes, you can play non-engine cards to kind of compete, but it's difficult, and a deck like this just seems so explosive. It can make some insane boards. You guys have seen the combo videos. You know how strong the deck is, but it's really just Rogue at best. I think it has a lot more potential than some of the other decks on this list, but as long as these other decks are top tier, I think it's going to be very difficult for a deck like BA Phantom Knight to be able to do anything whatsoever. Next up is Shaddoll. I'm going to put this at Rogue as well. This could be any sort of Shaddoll variant, like Invoke Shaddoll, Dogmatica Shaddoll. The reason I have this on here is because Winda's very similar to a deck like Drytron being able to produce Vanity's Ruler, right? You know, it's not True King of All Calamities, it's not Vanity's Ruler, but Winda's still pretty good, and some decks are going to be able to incorporate that, and so I feel like this deck still has a spot in the Rogue category just because it has that sort of win button against some of these very special summon heavy decks. Now, I think the biggest issue here is Eldich being at the top. Eldich just shits on Shaddoll, like flat out. It is so hard for Shaddoll to be good when Eldich is this highly represented because Eldich just doesn't care about Shaddoll at all. And so I feel like with this being the case, I don't think Shaddoll's really going to be able to do much. I think just because of these other decks, however, it's enough to bump Shaddoll up from being just everything else up into Rogue. Again, we have to see. Next up is COVID-19 and coronavirus, the tier 0 contender for the past 10 months. Thank you so much, Virus. It has been so fun staying at home. I know how you guys are feeling. We're all sick of being home and not being able to go out and play Yu-Gi-Oh! We're trying to do our best through remote duels, through all these tournaments that get thrown online. Hopefully one day we'll be able to go back and actually be able to enjoy it and, you know, not really have to worry about these things. But yeah, I didn't really think that when I started doing this little meme that coronavirus and COVID-19 was going to be tier 0 for 10 months. Talk about needing a ban list hit. This is definitely needed. Next up is True Draco. This is everything else. Like, True King's Return went to 2. That's cool. Is the deck any good? Not really. True Draco is just not going to be able to compete with any of these other decks. You might see someone try to play it with 2 True King's Return. There's some cool synergies with some of these other decks in here, but this card could have gone to 3 and it wouldn't have changed anything. People are still not going to play the deck because it's just not as good as these other decks, just flat out. Next up is Prank Kids. I'm actually going to put this at tier 2. This deck got a reasonable amount of representation over the weekend. I don't believe it converted at all to the top 16, but for a combo deck, it's actually able to produce some pretty reasonable boards. I just think if you're going to play combo, you might as well just play Virtual World or Drytron because those decks just seem so much more resilient. They don't seem to lose to nearly as many just forms of interaction as a deck like Prank Kids might, but people just want to play Prank Kids just because the new Link 1 is really cool. So the representation has boosted this up, I believe, to tier 2, and it's going to sit here for a while, at least until the meta fleshes itself out a little bit more. And then wrapping things up is Dinosaur. You know, this deck used to be one of the most terrifying decks in the format, but I think I'm going to go ahead and and throw this at a hefty tier 2. This deck is really interesting since the new changes for the December ban list, as well as the release of Genesis Impact. When you look at these decks up here, it's very difficult for Dinosaur to be able to compete. Virtual World can make True King of all calamities almost every single time without fail, and Dinosaur doesn't really have a native out to that. In addition to that, it has the Trap card, which is able to pop some of the best threats that it has, and so when you're not able to stick something like an Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, I mean, how is that going to bode well for you if you can't even do what your deck does best? When you look at a deck like Drytron, when it's able to just go turn 1 Vanity's Ruler with protection from both monster effects and spell and trap effects, again, how does Dinosaur beat that? It can't. Like, it is almost impossible for it to do so, and Eldich can kind of just outgrind Dinosaur in a lot of ways. So it's really interesting that the fall of Infernoble and Dragon Link has actually naturally forced down Dinosaur, because Dinosaur was really only good because of the other decks at the top. So very interesting to see how this plays out. The deck still has a very high amount of representation. People love Dinosaurs. Miscellaneousaurus is still at 3, by the way, so do not expect this deck to be going anywhere, but I think in terms of power as well as representation, it's going to be sitting at tier 2, but a very strong tier 2 at that, until maybe people realize that the deck just can't compete with the rest, but we will have to see what happens. So guys, that's going to wrap it up for the December 2020 tier list. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.